The old dog cried and begged his owner not to kick him away, but what happened next shocked everyone. There's something truly special about those golden years, isn't there? When the world slows down and you find comfort in the simple things. The quiet of the morning, the warmth of the afternoon sun, the familiar creak of an old rocking chair. Life settles into a rhythm that feels just right. For Old Man Henry and his dog Buddy, those years were nothing short of bliss. They lived in a small but cozy house on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. The kind of place where the air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle in the spring, and fireflies danced like tiny flickering stars in the summer nights. It was peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond their little haven. Henry was a retired carpenter. His hands, gnarled from decades of working with wood, told the story of a life spent crafting and building. Once they had been steady, strong, capable of turning rough planks into something beautiful. Now they trembled slightly, the weight of time settling into his bones. He didn't mind much. He had lived a good life, one filled with love, work, and quiet satisfaction. But there was an emptiness that had settled in the house, one that had been there since his wife Martha passed away. For years after her death, the house felt too silent. The laughter, the conversations, the shared moments, they had all disappeared with her. It was just Henry now, left to sit on his front porch, watching the days roll by like waves on a distant shore. He had never been much of a pet person. Martha had always wanted a dog, but Henry had been reluctant. Too much work, he'd say. Too much trouble. But then Buddy came along. Buddy wasn't much to look at when Henry first found him. A scrawny little thing, all fur and big pleading eyes, abandoned by the side of the road on a cold evening. Henry hadn't planned on keeping him. He figured he'd take the pup to the local shelter, let them handle it. But as he drove home, those eyes haunted him. There was something about the way the little dog had looked at him, as if begging for another chance at life. So Henry turned the car around. He brought the pup home, gave him a warm bath, and poured a small bowl of milk. The dog lapped it up, his tail wagging ever so slightly. That night, the little thing curled up at Henry's feet, and for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel quite so empty. He named him Buddy, because that's what he became, his best friend. Buddy was a mixed breed, mostly Labrador with a touch of something else thrown in for good measure. He grew fast, his thick golden coat shining in the sunlight, his eyes filled with an intelligence that Henry swore understood every word he said. The two became inseparable. Wherever Henry went, Buddy followed. Mornings started the same way every day. Buddy would nudge Henry's hand, a soft reminder that the sun was up and it was time to get moving. Henry would groan, stretch his stiff joints, and finally get up. After a slow breakfast, they'd take a walk down the road to the local diner. Henry liked the routine of it, the predictability. A cup of coffee, a chat with the regulars, a pat on Buddy's head from the kind waitress who always had a biscuit tucked away for him. Afternoons were spent in the backyard. Henry still kept a small vegetable garden, though his knees made it harder to tend to it the way he used to. Buddy would lie in the grass, basking in the sun, his tail thumping softly against the dirt whenever Henry spoke to him. Sometimes Henry would sit beside him, running his hand through Buddy's fur as he reminisced about the past. "You know, Buddy," Henry would say, his voice thick with nostalgia, "Martha would have loved you. She always wanted a dog." And Buddy, as if understanding, would nuzzle Henry's hand in response. Evenings were their favorite time. They'd sit together on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Buddy would rest his head on Henry's lap, and Henry would talk about Martha, about his days as a carpenter, about things he missed and things he was grateful for. "You ever think about how time just slips away?" Henry mused one evening, staring at the fading light. "One day you're young, strong, got the whole world ahead of you. Next thing you know, you're old and you're just sitting here wondering where it all went." Buddy simply wagged his tail, content just to be by Henry's side. Life was simple, but it was good. It was filled with small moments, the kind that might not seem like much to an outsider but meant the world to those who lived them. But life has a way of changing, doesn't it? One minute everything is as it should be, peaceful, familiar. The next, a storm is brewing on the horizon, one that threatens to turn everything upside down. Henry didn't see it coming. He didn't know that the golden years he had come to cherish were about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Because the thing about life is, no matter how much you try to hold on to the good moments, change is inevitable. And sometimes, that change comes like a thief in the night, taking more than you ever thought you could lose. Ever notice how the weather can change so quick? One minute it's all sunshine and blue skies, the next dark clouds roll in and you just know a storm's coming. That's how it was for Henry and Buddy. Their golden years, once peaceful and serene, started to feel heavier, like a sky darkening before a downpour. It began with little things, subtle shifts that didn't seem like much on their own. But when you put them all together they became impossible to ignore. Henry's knees were the first to give him trouble. It started with an ache here and there, a stiffness in the mornings that took longer to shake off. But over time the pain grew worse. Walking to the diner, once an easy morning ritual, became harder. He started using a cane, but even that only helped so much. Buddy, always perceptive, slowed his pace to match Henry's. He never pulled on the leash, never hurried ahead. If Henry had to stop and catch his breath, Buddy would just sit by his side, waiting patiently. Then came the forgetfulness. First it was small things, misplacing his glasses, forgetting why he walked into a room. But then it started to add up. He forgot appointments, forgot to pay a bill or two. He would set something down and swear it disappeared, only to find it in the most obvious place hours later. He tried to laugh it off, blaming old age. But deep down it scared him. And then there was the money. Henry had never been a wealthy man, but he'd always gotten by. After Martha passed, he managed on his pension and a little savings. It was enough to live a modest life. But medical bills started piling up. Doctor visits, medication for his knees, unexpected costs he hadn't planned for. He tried to stretch every dollar, cutting back where he could. No more morning coffee at the diner. No more small treats for Buddy. He stayed home more, the world outside growing smaller and smaller. Buddy noticed the change. The air in the house felt different, heavier. Henry wasn't talking as much, wasn't laughing. He sat on the porch less, spent more time staring at the pile of bills on the kitchen table. And when he thought Buddy wasn't looking, Henry let out long, tired sighs. Then one day a letter arrived. Henry's hands trembled as he opened it. It was from the bank. Mortgage overdue. He read the words again and again as if hoping they would change. He hadn't even realized he'd fallen behind. He had always been careful with his money, but somehow, it had gotten away from him. The letter gave him a deadline. A date he had to come up with the money or else. Henry felt his stomach tighten. He looked at Buddy, his only family, his only constant in a world that was becoming more uncertain by the day. "What are we gonna do, boy?" he whispered. Buddy whined, nudging Henry's hand as if sensing his distress. Desperation led Henry to places he never thought he'd go. He reached out to family, but they were struggling themselves, unable to help. He considered selling some of Martha's jewelry, but just the thought of it made his heart ache. That was all he had left of her. He couldn't let go of it. Then there was Frank. Frank had been Henry's friend for years. A successful businessman, always seemed to have money to spare. Henry swallowed his pride and went to see him, explaining the situation, his voice trembling. He hated asking for help, but what choice did he have? Frank listened, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Henry. I really am. But I can't help you. Things are tight for me too." Henry stared at him. Tight? Frank lived in a house 3 times the size of Henry's, drove a brand new car every year, went on vacations without a second thought. But in Henry's moment of need, Frank was turning his back on him. Henry left without another word. Buddy trotted beside him, sensing the defeat in his step. When they got home, Henry sat on the porch, staring at the house, the place he had built a life with Martha, the place where every memory was carved into the walls. And now he was going to lose it. A few days later, something stopped him in his tracks. Stuck in the ground near the sidewalk was a sign. "House for sale." Henry felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He hadn't put it there. He hadn't even thought about selling the house. His heart pounded as he rushed inside, his fingers fumbling as he tore open the latest letter from the bank. His breath caught in his throat. The house had been sold. And the buyer? Frank. Henry's vision blurred with shock and betrayal. His friend. The man he trusted. The one he had gone to for help had gone behind his back and bought the very home he was desperate to save. Buddy whimpered, sensing something was terribly wrong. Henry sank into the chair, his hands shaking. "He took our house, boy," he whispered. "He took everything." Frank showed up later that day, acting like nothing had happened. "It's just business, Henry," he said, his voice flat. He handed Henry a check, A small amount of money that wasn't even close to the home's true value. "I'll give you 30 days to move out." Henry looked at the check, then back at Frank. He wanted to scream, to curse, to demand an explanation. But what was the point? Frank had already made up his mind. The next month passed in a blur. Henry packed up what little he had left. Every item felt like a piece of his soul being torn away. The memories, the laughter, the late-night talks with Martha, the quiet mornings with Buddy, all of it would stay in that house while he was forced to leave. The day they left, Henry didn't look back. He couldn't. He walked away with Buddy at his side, his heart heavy with loss. He had lost his home, his friend, his trust in people. But as long as he had Buddy, he wasn't completely alone. Still, the question loomed over him like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Where were they supposed to go now? Sometimes the hardest blows come from where you least expect them. Not a stranger, not some faceless corporation. No, it's the ones closest to you. The ones you trust. Those are the people who can hurt you the most. Henry had lost his home. The place where he and Martha built a life together, filled with laughter, love, and memories, gone just like that. And worse than losing the house itself was knowing who had taken it. Frank. A man Henry had called a friend. The betrayal cut deep like a knife twisting in his gut. It wasn't just about the house. It was about trust. It was about years of friendship reduced to a business transaction. Henry and Buddy packed up the last of their belongings and left. They had nowhere to go, no plan, no real options. He had a small check from Frank, the so-called payment for the house, but it was barely enough to keep them afloat. They ended up in a run-down motel on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the paint peeled from the walls, the carpets smelled like mildew, and the flickering neon sign outside buzzed all night long. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap beer. It wasn't home. Not even close. Henry felt like a ghost of himself. He sat on the edge of the stiff motel bed, staring at the walls, his hands limp in his lap. He barely ate, barely spoke. The weight of everything pressed down on him, suffocating. And Buddy? He noticed. Buddy, who had always been full of energy, who had always wagged his tail and greeted Henry with warmth, now watched him with worried eyes. He nudged Henry's hand, licked his fingers, curled up beside him, trying to comfort him. But Henry barely reacted. The days stretched on. The world outside continued to turn, but for Henry, time stood still. He had lost his sense of purpose. He had lost the will to fight. Buddy, however, had not. One evening, as Henry sat staring at nothing, Buddy walked over and laid his head on Henry's lap. The old man absent-mindedly stroked his fur, but there was no real emotion in the gesture. Buddy whined softly, his big brown eyes pleading. Henry sighed. "What are we gonna do, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Buddy didn't have the words, but he had the answer. Because Buddy never gave up on Henry. Even when Henry had given up on himself. That night something shifted. For the first time in weeks, Henry took Buddy for a walk. They left the motel and wandered down the road. The night air was cool and crisp, and the sky was clear, littered with stars. As they walked, Henry spoke. He told Buddy everything, his pain, his anger, his regret. He spoke about Martha, about their home, about how much he missed the life they had. He spoke about Frank, about the betrayal, about how lost he felt. And Buddy listened. Just like he always did. His ears perked up, his tail wagged slightly. He was Henry's silent confidant, his unwavering source of comfort. By the time they returned to the motel, Henry felt just a little bit lighter. The weight on his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had loosened its grip, just enough for him to breathe again. The next day, fate stepped in. Henry and Buddy were walking along the road when a car pulled over beside them. A young woman stepped out. "Henry?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Henry blinked, trying to place her face. Then he saw the logo on her shirt. *Charleston Animal Rescue. He remembered her. She had seen Buddy a few times when Henry brought him to the shelter for checkups. She had always been kind, always had a soft spot for older dogs. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Where's your house?" Henry hesitated before telling her everything. How he had lost the house, how Frank had betrayed him, how he was living in a motel with nowhere else to go. Sarah listened, her expression filled with sympathy. When he finished, she nodded. "There's a place that might be able to help you," she said. Henry frowned. "A shelter?" "No," Sarah said. "It's a senior dog rescue. They take in older dogs and sometimes their owners too. It's not just a shelter. It's a community. A place where people like you can get back on their feet. Henry looked down at Buddy, who was sitting patiently at his feet. He thought about it. The motel was no place for them. And the truth was he couldn't keep living like this, dragging Buddy through his misery. After a long pause he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Sarah smiled. "You won't regret it." The drive to Golden Paws Haven didn't take long. When they arrived, Henry was surprised by what he saw. It wasn't some sad, overcrowded shelter. It was a ranch, a wide open space with small cottages, a big fenced-in yard and dozens of happy dogs running around. Martha, the woman who ran the rescue, ironically sharing the same name as Henry's late wife, greeted him with warmth. She showed him around, explaining how the rescue worked. "We have a few senior residents who live here with their dogs," she said. "We believe no one should have to choose between their home and their best friend." Henry felt something inside him shift. He had expected pity, but what he found was kindness, dignity, hope. They gave him a small cottage, a modest one-room space but clean and welcoming. Buddy sniffed around excitedly, his tail wagging again for the first time in a long while. For the first time since losing his home, Henry felt like he belonged somewhere. The days that followed were not easy, but they were good. Henry started volunteering at the rescue, helping with the dogs, fixing things around the property. It gave him purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. Buddy thrived at Golden Paws. He made friends with the other dogs, played in the yard, received endless belly rubs from volunteers. He was happy. And in turn so was Henry. One day Sarah came to visit. She found Henry sitting on the porch, Buddy resting at his feet. "You look different," she said. "Better." Henry nodded. "I am," he admitted. "Thanks to you." Sarah smiled. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did the rest." Henry looked down at Buddy and scratched his ears. "We did the rest," he corrected. The storm hadn't completely passed. There were still wounds that needed healing, still nights when the weight of the past crept in. But Henry was no longer drowning in it. He was learning to let go, to move forward. And he had Buddy by his side. That was enough. Life has a funny way of surprising you. Just when you think you've reached the end of the road, a new path opens up, one you never expected. For Henry and Buddy, that new path led them to a place of healing. Golden Paws Haven became more than just a shelter. It became a home. Henry, who had once been drowning in grief and betrayal, slowly found himself again. The people there didn't see him as a burden. They saw him as a man who still had something to offer. And Buddy? He thrived. He had space to run, new friends to play with, and more love than he could have ever imagined. The light returned to his eyes, the bounce to his step. Henry saw it, and in seeing Buddy's happiness he found his own. At first he struggled with the idea of accepting help. He had always been independent, the kind of man who took care of himself. But Martha, the kind woman who ran the rescue, told him something that stuck with him. "Accepting kindness isn't weakness, Henry," she said. "It's strength. It means you're still willing to move forward." And so he let himself be helped. He let himself heal. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Henry wasn't just a resident at Golden Paws, he became part of the team. He found a sense of purpose in taking care of the dogs, helping with chores, fixing up things around the ranch. Martha noticed his skills right away. "You were a carpenter, weren't you?" she asked one morning as she watched him repair a broken fence. 40 years, Henry nodded. "Built half the houses in Charleston." "Well," she said, smiling, "I hope you don't mind, but I might have a few projects for you." And just like that, Henry had a job again. Not one that paid in money, but one that paid in meaning. He fixed kennels, built new benches for the yard, even crafted a sign for the front entrance of Golden Paws Haven. Every nail he hammered, every board he sanded, made him feel like himself again. Buddy was always right there with him, supervising, his tail wagging happily. But there was still one thing Henry hadn't done. He hadn't confronted Frank. The anger, the betrayal, it still sat inside him, a quiet ache that wouldn't go away. Martha noticed. "You can't move forward until you make peace with the past," she told him one evening as they watched the sunset. Henry wasn't sure he wanted to see Frank again. But deep down he knew Martha was right. A few days later he picked up the phone. Frank answered on the third ring. "Henry." His voice was hesitant. Henry took a deep breath. We need to talk. They agreed to meet at a small diner in town. Henry brought Buddy with him. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. When he walked into the diner, Frank was already there, sitting at a booth in the back. He looked different. Older. More tired. Henry, Frank said, standing up. Henry didn't shake his hand. He just sat down, Buddy settling at his feet. For a moment there was silence. Then Frank sighed. I messed up, Henry, he said. I know I did. Henry clenched his jaw. You didn't just mess up, Frank. You took everything from me. I was desperate, Frank admitted. I made bad investments. I thought buying the house would fix things for me. But it didn't. I sold it, Henry. And I regret it every day. Henry studied him. He looked like a man who had lost just as much as he had gained. And for the first time Henry saw not just the betrayal but the regret. I don't want your money, Henry said finally. I just want to know, why? Frank's eyes filled with something Henry hadn't expected. Guilt. Because I was selfish, Frank admitted. And I lost a friend because of it. Henry exhaled slowly. The weight of years of anger, of loss, of betrayal, it started to lift. I forgive you, he said. Frank's eyes widened. You do. Henry nodded. Not for you. For me. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. I made money off the house. More than I deserved. I want you to have it. Henry hesitated. Then for the first time in a long time he let himself accept help. He took the check. Thank you, he said quietly. They left the diner not as friends, but as two men who had finally found closure. With the money Frank had given him, Henry made a decision. He bought a small mobile home. Nothing fancy but cozy. A place he and Buddy could call their own again. It was just outside Charleston, not too far from Golden Paws Haven. Close enough that he could still visit, still help out. The first night in their new home, Henry sat on the porch, Buddy curled up beside him. The stars shone brightly overhead, and for the first time in a long time Henry felt at peace. You know, boy, he murmured, scratching Buddy's ears. I think we're gonna be okay. Buddy wagged his tail as if to say, I know, Henry. I know. The years passed. Henry and Buddy grew older together, their bond deepening with each passing day. Henry still volunteered at Golden Paws. He taught the younger residents carpentry skills, shared his stories, made sure every dog that came through the doors felt loved. One day Sarah, the woman who had saved them, came to visit. She found Henry sitting on his porch, Buddy at his feet. You look good, Henry, she said. Henry smiled. I feel good. Sarah looked at Buddy. And him. Henry reached down, rubbing the dog's fur. He's still my best friend. Sarah nodded. You both deserve this. Henry watched her go, then turned back to Buddy. We did all right, didn't we, boy? Buddy licked Henry's hand, his tail thumping softly against the porch boards. And in that moment, as the sun set and the world turned golden, Henry knew he had found what he had been searching for all along. Peace. Love. A new dawn.